I would like to say good morning to Winthrop University, and I would like to first start by thanking all those who made this occasion happen today. I'm very happy to be here on your campus. It's a beautiful campus, and I'm even happier to look at the beautiful people. So I would like to say hello. I have a question. Is anybody in the house representing Delta Sigma Theta? I've got one Delta in the house. The Deltas became a very important part of my life because my mother absolutely loved her fraternity. My father's Alpha Psi Alpha, but my mother loved the Deltas so much. She loved them so much that she gave me the name Theta. For a long time, she would say Theta, but as I got older, I said, but Mom, that's Theta. And she says, okay, you can say it the way you want to. But so I started with my attachment to Deltas early on. Red is one of my favorite colors. I think it's very vibrant, and it just so happens to be the Delta's favorite color also. I would like to start out by sharing a little bit. I've looked out into the audience, and a lot of young, beautiful people. And I don't really know how many people actually know my mother's story. If you've read her book or have read an article or know something about her, just kind of give me your hands and I'll know how deep to dive. Okay, so I'm going to dive in. Thank you. Thank you very much. So my mother wrote a book, first of all, called Dear Senator. It was her memoirs. She did not publish her book until about 2004. She was a daughter of the late Senator Strom Thurmond. I'm sure even if you're young, you may have heard that name because there's a building here on campus. And as you go around to different places in South Carolina, that name is alive, very much so. So many different things are named after Strom Thurmond. And so what I'd like to start with to kind of give you a glance into what she was about. I'm going to read her dedication page at the first part of the book. And in her dedication, she says, the book is dedicated to my children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Continue the journey of life, love, and family. Endure the hardships and embrace the future. Judge not the ethnicity of the person, but scrutinize the character. And I'm going to dwell there for a minute because this is the perfect place to talk about embracing your future. What does your future look like? Well, one of the greatest lessons I learned from my mother is that your past does not have to have anything to do with your future. You can calculate and plot your course as to where and what you want your future to be. And she dwelled on that for many, many years, and it got into my head even when I didn't want to listen. Because it's so interesting when we're young, at least for me. First of all, by the time I was 14, I didn't even feel I needed any more education. I felt very informed, and I felt very adult. I felt I had experienced most of the things that life had to offer, and I was ready to launch out with my own agenda. But if you have a good parent who knows how to, my mother was an educator for over 30 years in the classroom. My mother was a good classroom manager. So she knew how to manage her children in a way that was non-offensive and in a way that was non-threatening. And so that's how I grew up in my mother's house, sometimes not even realizing that there was a lesson in almost everything that she placed in our way on a daily basis. The other thing I want to share with you this afternoon is a lot of that training took place at our dining room table. And that is a wonderful and easy way to hear what's going on. My mother had 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls. The age variation is that the brothers were born a year apart, and my sister and I were born 2.5 years apart. And so if you just let your children sometimes or friends come together and just listen to what they have to say about what's going on in the culture. You can learn a lot without ever asking. So my mother did a great deal of listening. And then afterwards, she was able to guide us and take that whatever course was of action which was necessary. So you really never felt like you were being chastised or being tutored to or even being reprimanded. She just made it a natural and flowing conversation. And it's interesting because I grew up loving conversation. I love the word. Conversation can inform you if you are a good listener of a lot of different information. And so that's what with dialogue at the table. She would let us have these different conversations about different things going on in the culture itself. I have a PowerPoint presentation I'd like to share with you. First of all, repeating, reckoning the Strom-Thurmond lineage with my family's legacy. And I was like, oh, that's deep. Okay, and I had created a title, but someone says, let's improve on that title a little bit. So I said, reckoning. You know, have you ever sat down and really reckoned with something that was difficult in your life? You have to give it much thought. So I have to say that in preparation for my talk today, I actually found a great opportunity in the preparation because it helped me to have a more in-depth study and analyze who I really am at this point in my life. And there's nothing like going back through the good is easy, but going back through maybe what wasn't so good that you did or what you didn't do so well, but I decided to dwell there. And one thing I found out that's for sure is that I have a lot of capacity to become even more. At 58 years of age, I plan to become more. I plan to do more. And I would like to encourage all of you to want to do more, to want to do better, to want to do good in the world that you live in. That is, my degree is in Human Services Community Organization. And you'll see why through my little PowerPoint that I'm going to share with you. Because for a long time, I didn't understand why did I always have a desire to help those who appear to need help. And so even family members would have to say, why are you always concerned about these people over here? And my mother, no matter where we went, from at least I remember the age of 6, I would tug at her skirt, see someone with a cup or a can or someone laying on the sidewalk. I grew up in Los Angeles, and we had to help them. We needed to give to them. And so my mother's like, what's going on in your mind? What are you thinking? But I just saw that some people needed a lot more help than other people. And I'm not offended by that. I'm not bothered by that. As a domestic violence advocate, I serve people where their relationship has gone so awry that they even have to end up in shelter. And that's hard, to leave everything that you know and have to go live in a strange place in order to be safe. They are not safe in the home any longer. And so domestic violence can actually affect people who you don't have to have a personal relationship with them, but any type of intimate relationship as a friend or a sister or brother, just that you intimately know in some way. You don't have to have a direct relationship with them. My legacy to you is the discovery of your lineage. On October 12, 1925, Essie Mae was born into to a mother by the name of Carrie Butler, who lived in Aiken, South Carolina, and she was 15 years old. My grandmother was a cook in the home of the late Senator Strom-Thurmond. And the story that my mother told, that her mother told her, is that he'd rather hang out in the kitchen because she cooked so well. And he loved her food. He even ate in the kitchen instead of going and eating in the dining room with his family. But what some people don't know who have read the book is that she had another sister who worked in the house as a housekeeper. So oftentimes people say, oh, she was a housekeeper, but she was actually the cook. And one very important thing that I put up there that I want people to know, because that's not in the book and maybe not known, is that my mother was born into poverty. My grandmother was 15 years old and unwed. And once she was pregnant, the family didn't want her there, and so that means now she's jobless. I can't see the screen from here, but and I don't have the one over here, but this tells just a little bit about what happened to her when she was 6 months old. So her mother's 15, so she's probably 15 and a half at that point, and my mother got pneumonia. And she tried everything she could. She took her, now Aiken is still rural to me because I grew up in the big city of Los Angeles, but it was even more rural in 1925. And so the town doctor said, well, there's nothing we can do for her. And so she did what a lot of us do. We go to the big sister. And she took my mother to Coatesville, Pennsylvania, which her older sister, Mary, says, I'll take care of her. Well, obviously my mother lived till she was 87 years old, so she did a good job of taking care of her. And it says that about a year later, Carrie came back to take my mother back in possession, and her sister told her, no, Essie's my baby now. You go and have a good life. And she was obedient to that, and she did leave her there. Essie Mae Butler. This is one of my aunts. She is named after her, so that's another sister that she had. There were 5 sisters and 3 brothers. It's interesting because no one ever talks much about the brothers, so I really don't know much about them, but I know about the sisters. And she was my mother's favorite aunt also. In 1938, and what I did was try to parallel comparisons of what was going on between my mother's life and our life while Senator Strom Thurmond was living here in South Carolina. In 1938, he became the court circuit judge, and my mother was going to her first segregated school. And it's an interesting story because from kindergarten through 6th grade, my mother went to a school that was integrated in Coatesville, Pennsylvania. And in someone's strange thought life, they decided we're going to separate them when they get to the 7th grade. We're going to separate them for the 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. And then in 10th, they come back together at Coatesville High School. And it's interesting because some of them had really tight relationships, and my mother talked about that in the book. But when they entered the high school, the same friends they had had before them for approximately 6 years didn't associate with them anymore. I think they learned a lot in those 3 years about what was going on in the culture. So now they went from being physically separated to now being separated socially. That's a picture of my mother when she's about 14 years old. And that's her cousin actually ended up, I called her my aunt, but she would have been a second cousin, actually ended up being a wonderful person, and we just loved her as an auntie. This photo was taken around when she was 17 years old, and she was growing into being a very beautiful woman. Young woman. She met her father at this point. So it's interesting because Carrie Butler comes back into the picture, and she goes to where they live in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, because she had returned to South Carolina, and came into the living room one day. My mother had answered the door, and she kind of abruptly pushed her through the door, and she said, "Oh, can I help you?" And she says, "Girl, I'm your mother. Come here and give me a big hug." Shock therapy doesn't work for everyone. People like to say things that, for the shock value at times. I do that myself. My daughters grew up with that, a little shock therapy. But that was she couldn't understand that. So at that point, she's almost 17 years old and finding out, well, how are you my mother? And she says, just tell your mama to come out here. So her sister came out and she said, tell Essie I'm her mother. And so she said, Mary said, yes, Essie, May, she's your biological mother. And then she says, you know what? I'm going to come back in a few months and I'm going to take you to meet your father. And that was another shocking thing because she thought her aunt's husband was her father. And she says, oh, okay. So now you're trying to compute this. Okay, that's my aunt now. That's not my mother. And I have another father. So she did return in about 6 months. And she took her to an office in Edgefield. He was an attorney and working in the government at the time. And so a nice black gentleman answered the door. And she said, I was thinking, oh my God, this is my father. I'm going to meet my father for the first time. But he says, come in, and I will see if I believe governor at the time will see you, have a seat. And so they waited, and then he showed them in, and they walked in, closed the door, and she says, Essie Mae, this is your father. A little shock therapy once again. Never even thought of herself as having white in her. She was fair-skinned, but not really thinking that. And that's her at her high school graduation. So what happened is that, and I'm quickly giving you a summary, is that from that moment forward, Strom Thurmond stayed in touch with her. So when she's graduating high school, he said, well, what are you going to do now? You're going to college, right? And she said, well, yes, I want to go to nursing school. And he says, well, great. So she went to nursing school in New York. And this is one of the clubs she was introduced to in New York. Those are actually her aunt and uncle and cousin. And she found out she loved music, so she was being exposed to so many things in New York City that were just wonderful to her she had never experienced. Well, she finished nursing school, and she wanted to work at the New York hospital, and she was told, well, you can't work here. And she said, but I've done all my training here. Why? I love this hospital. She says, no, you have to go to Harlem. You have to go over where they hired the colored nurses. And my mother was so frustrated. So imagine at this point, she's about 20 in that picture. So she's learned things through her 20 years of life. And everything is constantly pointing separatism, that I can't even work at the hospital that I've come to love. So it was okay for the training, but not for her to do her professional life. Well, her and the senator, because that's what we always called him, and that's why the book is called Dear Senator. We never said grandfather, she never said father or dad. We always said the senator. They were having many conversations, and he said, Essie Mae, you need to come to school here in South Carolina, because she told him what happened. And actually, she said he never made a comment. And if you know the history of him politically, it's interesting that he didn't make a comment and saying, oh, I'm so sorry you had to go through that. But he said nothing. He just listened to what she had to say. And he said, well, you need to come to school in South Carolina. There's a wonderful college down here, South Carolina State. And so my mother thought about it, and she packed up, and she went to State. Delta. My mother loved, I cannot say it enough. There are so many people approaching me now, so Monica, you have to be a Delta. You already have the name. So this is her sorority, and it was interesting. I really want you to look at this picture. We're not going to be able to do it on both screens, right? Okay, so looking at this picture, there are many women in there. And one of the questions as I was growing older and learning the difference between people, I said, but Mom, I thought you went to an all-black college. And I said, these ladies aren't black, they're white. And she says, well, But people know who they come from, and they know they have black blood in them. So they have to go to state too. And if you can identify, I'm like, there's no way at all. So it was interesting. My mother said she had thought about that when she was younger, but that was the grouping and how it was done. Now, in 1947, she met a fine brother on campus, okay? And that gentleman to the back and in the middle is my dad. His name is Joyce Thomas Williams, and he was in law school. Well, he was taking the prereqs, pre-law. And I have to point out one more person in the picture for sure. Your right, okay, yeah, on the right, sitting down. You ever heard of a gentleman called Jesse Owens? The great runner? He was in his, and that's his fraternity brothers right there. And there's a few other famous people in there, but I forget their name, and I wasn't really focusing on pointing all of that out. But Essie Mae she was Williams now, married my father in North Carolina in 1948. They fell madly in love with one another. And that is the law school student body, right there in that picture. Now, interestingly, and for those of you who might have read ahead, there was no school in the state of South Carolina in 1948 where a black student could go. So this is history. And so my mother had another conversation. That's why I love to say, let's have the conversation. I told you I love that word. They had several conversations, and she says, I have to move because my husband needs to go to law school. And he says, Essie Mae, I'm going to get back with you on that. And surely enough, he got back, and he says, you know what? We have found $2 million in the budget that's going to go to state to start a law school. My father was one of two of the first graduates out of South Carolina State Law School. That was a generous gift. But I think Strom Thurmond was very persuasive. And $2 million went a lot further back then than it did now. Okay. Well, 1949, February 9th, they had their first son, my beautiful older brother, Julius Thomas Williams III, who passed away 3 months before my mother of lung cancer. And I won't get into smoking right now. But they were very proud of their son. And it was interesting because Strom Thurmond was proud of him too. Now at this point, that's the student body that actually eventually all graduated from state. And I spoke at Clemson University last night, and people were informing me of extra information, especially our more mature people from the audience who actually went to state, and they were sharing things with me, such as the fact that the law school just finally stopped about 1970, so they don't have a law program there anymore. Well, a year after that, my brother Ronald was born. And it's so interesting. I knew my brother's name was Ronald J. Williams. The J stood for James. James Strom Thurmond. That's where that name came from. And she didn't tell him for a while either, so he kind of had the theta thing going, but it was James from our grandfather. Then my father was called away to the Korean War in the midst of law school. And it was interesting because my, more of an adopted uncle, his best friend, informed us that my father was very smart, very, very intelligent. And Ronald James Williams, yeah, he's a genius. He tested and came out, he was a genius, so I assume my father was a genius. And he knew the law. And he read everything, and he made the mistake of talking to a superior officer a little too uppity. And they decided to throw my dad into what the punishment was this little wooden, almost like a coffin, that stood up straight. And they put him in there for 3 days. I don't even know if there was water or food given to him because he showed himself to be intelligent. Well, my dad was about fed up. Once he finished law school, he wasn't making much money. He has 2 children now, well, they have 2 children, and he decided, I need to get away from Jim Crow. I need to get away from all this separatism. And here I have a father-in-law who endorses separatism. And so he actually was hired into the aerospace industry in Los Angeles. But it was after much stress in the South that he just couldn't take it anymore, basically. And so that's why they packed up. And his sister lived in Los Angeles. Interestingly enough, she was a social worker. So there were certain areas you could go into and you wouldn't even relate to the things that were going on here at the time. And he was very successful in the aerospace industry. The only issue was he wanted to practice law. And then in 1954, my sister was born. And she was a lovely addition to the family. Very wonderful person. So about 1954, what was going on with Strom Thurmond at the time is that he's now in the U.S. Senate. He was a write-in candidate and won. And then Brown versus the Board of Education. And so do many of us know about that longest filibuster in the United States? Does anybody know who did that filibuster? Against civil rights. And so here I come in at 1956, shortly after that time, and I too would end up walking in my father's shoes, my mother's shoes, and my sister's shoes, and begin to learn that by age 6 I was colored. Now it's interesting because also as a preschool teacher, I taught for Head Start for many, many years. I would find out with young children that pretty much you have to tell them what they are. It just doesn't come to them, oh, I'm this, I'm that. It comes in usually through a comment or someone saying something. And well, that's the 1957 filibuster right there, 24 hours and I think 18 minutes, if I can't quite see it from here. But this is the lady that raised my mother, our Aunt Mary. But I never knew about this until I was 10 years old. To me, she was Grandma. I think we had a nickname for her. We used to call her Tiny. And so that was for us. But in 1959, my family moved from Los Angeles because my mother wanted to take care of her mother. So this is, and I keep saying it, that my grandmother. So please understand, I don't want to confuse you. But to me, she was my grandmother. As Essie Mae had nursed, she had nursed Essie Mae back to health, so she wanted to go nurse her mother. 6 months after we got there, she passed away, unfortunately. And about that time, a few years after that, the civil rights movement was really heating up, and my father, we were in Pennsylvania, and he wanted to be in Savannah. There was so much going on. He wanted to practice his law, so he got a job with the NAACP. And he worked for the Savannah chapter. Now, these points are important because I want you to keep in mind what was going on down here in South Carolina and what was going on with our lives. And that has to do with the reckoning. Because people say, well, how do you reconcile yourself to your lineage? You know? And the fact is that you could see my family was doing things that were kind of on the opposite side of the spectrum and developing into the people that they eventually would become. But this is, I think this particular one is, when he came to Savannah, Georgia, and went to work for the NAACP, and his job was to bail freedom fighters out, protesters, and what have you. And one interesting thing that came out of that we used to talk about at the table was that, in fact, he would get arrested sometimes. Kind of like similar to what happened to him when he was in the Marine Corps, when he spoke too knowledgeably, too intelligent. And I'm going to kind of speed through this because I really want to share a couple things about our conversations at the table that began to shape us. But that's just my family, the four of us together, the two girls, my mom and dad. And then in 1963, this was the Crusades, I'm trying to remember, that were going on at the time. And so for me, I'm born in 1956. This is on television. So I'm getting a view of the world. It was interesting because I was told we were like the only family that had a television on our block, and people would come to our house. Sometimes I said, Mom, who are all these people in here? But they also would have meetings. My father would in that house meet with Dr. King, Thurgood Marshall, and several other people who were very instrumental in the civil rights movement. And then we would have our neighbors that would come in also. And I used to always wonder, well, who are all these people? Well, on a trip we left to go to South Carolina to a homecoming game at State. And that is the day I learned I was colored. Hadn't thought about it. But we went into a diner, hopped up on a bar stool, my sister and I, and my mother had ordered, and he said we couldn't sit there. And my mother said, oh no, we're ordering to go and there's nobody in here. And he said, I don't care. They're colored and they can't sit here. Well, that clarified my life and it changed my life forever. And the fact I accepted that. So in my newfound who I am, I basically grew from there. We talked about another event of JFK, which was a blow to my family. But my dad passes away in 1964. But that doesn't end who we are. My mother was an excellent single parent, raised us, and we carried on with the ideals that we would sit and discuss around the table. Things about our race, equality, integration, any subject was open. And it was so interesting because our conversations were not tame at the table all the time, especially when there were no guests in the house. But just to have that openness to be able to express. And through each other's views, our brothers were 6 and 7 years older, so we had their view, and then each of us what we were learning, and then my mother would come in and kind of put the icing on the cake so that we would have understanding to that. We moved back to Los Angeles in 1964 to be around my father's sister, and my mother wanted to teach, and she had great opportunity to be able to teach there. So I was old enough, and I remember watching what they call the Watts riots on television. However, we decided we would call it a revolt. And as the years would pass by, that's my brother Jewish when he was graduating from high school, I had long curly hair, and I decided I need to have an afro. So I traded for cutting all my hair off, because now I'm taking on the characteristics of those on the West Coast. So the Black movement, the Black Panthers were up and coming, very impressive. Black nationalist organizations were organizing, talking about more of a culture revolution. And about 3 years after that, my mother actually allowed me to hang out with a number of Black sociologists. And they would meet. It was more of a Black nationalist type of organization, very educational. So once again, I think those polar opposites there between what was going on this side of the Continental Divide and what we were doing and being able and allowed to express ourselves. And this one is my older brother Ronnie took me to a Black Power rally, and I guess I got revved up after that. So, and we went to the dinner table and shared, and many of the different things that were discussed at the time. So these were the images. And this is at a point in right before it was about 1970, between 69 and 70, I was getting so radical and so revved up, and my mother didn't like many of the rhetoric I was talking, and some of the things were just plain unkind, that she says, Monica, I need to tell you something. She says, my father is alive. That was shocking. Now here's that shock value. And she said, not only is he alive, but he's white. I deflated. Because that was just an absolute shock to me. And I was just so into my afro and saying all of the slogans and what was going on in the culture at the time. And she gave me some things to think about. So notice when my mother said, judge not the ethnicity of the person, but scrutinize the character. From that point forward, and she actually had sat at our dining room table and we were all around for some holiday. And she said that over and over again to the point that we did start scrutinizing characters, very much so. And then I changed my name. And it was interesting because yesterday in the Strom Thurmond Institute, I found a letter that he had written to me because I sent him a invitation to, well, my mother sent him an invitation to my graduation. And I had changed my name by then. I took up a Swahili name, Pendeleza. So he wrote, Dear Miss Monica Pendeleza Williams. And he was accepting. And it's interesting because I found out from my mother that in fact, he was dialoguing about what we were doing all the time. He had quite an interest, just like I found out in my mother's book, of all places. So I'm in my 50s, and in her book, I find out she's taken him as an infant. You saw that picture with my father and him as an infant. When she goes down to Washington, D.C., or she would go to the governor's office, she took my brother right along with him. And it was a very interesting relationship. He was very interested, and that's my sister. So we were all active at that point and allowed to do what it is that we wanted to do. My mother even let me get into martial arts, and I ended up opening up a dojo at 18 years old. Because I was fortunate to have a job with Bank of America and be able to finance that. So I just wanted to give a view. Well, that's my firstborn. So this is the firstborn great-grandchild at this point, which Maria's in the audience today. And then, I got married in 1978 to a Marine corporal. So opposite from my rhetoric, my thoughts and everything, but we've been married 38 years this year. So my radicalness didn't tone down too much, and then we had a second daughter, and the third daughter, Marcy, who's here today. And in 1985, I had the opportunity to go work in Nordstrom's corporate office, and we moved to Seattle. So that's how our Seattle connection came into being. One of the things I want to point out very much, and then, I would love to hear, some of your questions that you might have about our family, is that my mother always admonished us to endure the difficulties. And that's what I like to pass on to the people that I serve. I am very much a public servant, that endure the difficulties and the hardships, because good can come if we persevere in any situation. The interesting thing is, I started working for the YWCA of Kitsap County in 1998. So paralleling that, when my mother in 1938, she couldn't go to the YWCA. And I wanted you to see, that's the national logo. The YWCA is about eliminating racism and empowering women. So the change, and that's one thing for sure, change is going to come. It always does. Now, how we want to deal with that change. My life changed very much from one end of the spectrum to the other. I look in the reckoning with Strom Thurmond, and I'll tell you the best way it was ever shared with me. I met about a 98-year-old preacher. His name was E.E. Cleveland, and he was at an event in Sacramento, California. And my brother-in-law says, hey, I would like to introduce you to him. And he says, well, this is one of Strom Thurmond's granddaughters. He says, I know Strom Thurmond. He says, he didn't do so well in the first and second and third and even the fourth inning. He said, but in the fifth and the sixth and the seventh, he started coming through. That's change and a shifting. And usually a question that people always would ask my mother or ask us, are you angry? Anger is unproductive. We can't do anything with it. It can stagnate you from being all in who you can be. So I may not like things that have happened to me. I don't even have to accept certain things that have happened to me or things that were said to me. But the one thing I can do is not let a person take anger and cause me to be a person that I don't want to be. I believe in going out into the world and doing good. Why not get up every morning feeling like I'm going to do good today? I want to leave my community a better place than when I inherited, when I came into the community. What can I do? Maybe that's a true heart of a community organizer. But I have always felt that way, and that's why I affiliated with myself with these organizations to assist in helping the life of African Americans do better. So I like to say, when Strom Thurmond knew better, I believe he did better. When we knew better, and my mother always instilled that in us, we did better. And in closing, I would like to say one thing I wanted to share, and I didn't want to forget, and that's why I stuck it back here on my notes. In my mother's book, she represents herself as many different characters and what she had experienced. And that is, my mother felt that her mother started out in difficult circumstances. But look at the product that came out of it. I believe that Essie Mae Williams was a waymaker and a builder of institutions. She cut her pathway to prosperity with fortitude, love, and self-respect, and a deep appreciation for learning. She had determined that it is never too late for anyone to return to school and to definitely move towards higher education. This was the beginning of what would be a lifetime of learning and a lifetime of teaching. I have decided that even though my mother has passed on, that her voice should not be silenced, that my sister and I, and as she said in her dedication, the grandchildren would pick it up, and that we would go out and that we would do good in the world, and that we would continue on her dream of what she saw. My mother's voice is compared to what she said, I'm kind of paraphrasing, to the lowly maids of Edgefield and the world. She speaks for my mother spoke for the fatherless, the poor, the homeless, and even the abused. She spoke for all those who never could find a good home to be raised in. She spoke for all who felt silenced from so much rejection, and those who chose the course of insurrection. So I would like to end by saying and encouraging one to continue in higher education, continue to change, continue to better yourself, and know that even though your circumstances seem so difficult, find someone that's a waymaker and latch on to them and become all that you want to be. Thank you. And so as time is ticking away, I would like to open up the floor for any questions or answers. And I think there's a mic over there and one over here. And even a comment, if you would have that. Surely there's some question out there.
I just want to say thank you for being here. I had the pleasure of meeting your mother when she came to Lineage to speak. So I'm so glad that you're continuing her legacy.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Did you actually?
And someone in the front? I'm sorry.
Did you ever actually help your grandmother?
Yes. Well, customarily, especially when we moved to California, and of course I moved there when we were 8 years old, he would call. Well, by living in Savannah, Georgia, I know the Southern voice, and I love to answer the phone, and so it would be for the first at least 4 years till I was about 12, he always would say, "May I please speak with SMA, please?" So I said, "Mom, it's that Southern voice on the phone. Come get the phone." And so I wouldn't say hello, nothing, besides the hello. That was about it, and I was done. And so what happened, I learned between the ages of about 10 and 12 who he was. So I really was running. I didn't know what to say because he had come to California to speak, and my mother took all four of us. Of course, my two brothers knew him and knew who he was, and my sister and I were meeting him for the first time. And then, but I never met him, but that one time in person. But my sister had traveled to Washington for my mother on business and had met with her. But yeah, we knew the voice.
And there were no pictures of Essie with Strong?
They never took a picture together. Remember, publicly, and it's interesting because people felt at times that, why, you know, did he really care for her? And if you read her book, she'll tell you it was a segregated type of love, even. But something about being in the privacy, and in the book she says, I wish we could have had even a dinner together. But he never asked her not to tell anybody, or he never told her not to tell anybody. Basically, he said, Essie, you do what you want to do. And there were very empowering conversations, but my mother also had very frustrating conversations as she grew older in life, but he loved to just be free. And it's interesting because it seemed like he was his freest self when they had these private conversations, that he was able to tell her everything going on in her life. You know, very interesting, different kind of relationship, but I look at it like this. I deal with a lot of, as a children's advocate and a woman's advocate, I hear about deadbeat dads all the time, you know, that don't come around, don't visit, they don't support. Strom Thurmond did give his support, and people say, oh, those were payoffs. But he didn't have to, but if you want to call it child support, you know, we're open to that because it helped our family. And another interesting thing, as I was in the Strom Thurmond Institute, and I was there 10 years ago, he never threw away anything. He has every one of my mother's letters, every copy of every letter he ever sent her, checks, money orders, all personal conversations. And they can be found there at the Institute there. If you don't want anybody to ever find you out, burn it, you know? Of course, I guess now they would be on Twitter, but I don't know, and, you know, conversating in Facebook. But he never, it was unbelievable how many aisles and rows of correspondence. I know they saved professional correspondence, but it was just unbelievable to personal. Yes, sir.
Was the Essie May family accepted by the Strom Thurmond family? Now, I know that he did, but how about with his family?
Okay. So it was interesting because, okay, the oldest one, because it's funny, they're actually my uncles, but I'm so much older than them. So I think it was Senator Paul Thurmond had heard some stories, because, you know, people like to let people know things, you know, gossip for some people is just real good stuff. But let him know, don't you know that your father has a half black child? And so he went to him with that. And how do I know this? Because he told my mother. And he told him, don't ever ask me that question. That's my business. And so I understand that Paul didn't ask him that question anymore. Now, when my mother came out with her story, I don't know how many of you followed it, but I think they did it in Charlotte. And that's because people were actually sending threats. It was supposed to happen in Columbia. They moved it to Charlotte because people were very upset that she had came out and said, Strom Thurmond's my father. So they moved the press conference over to another place. But when my mother met them finally, it's funny, Strom Thurmond used to go onto the campus of State. If you want a secret, why are you driving up in a limousine on the campus of State? And everybody knew the story, right? And then he would ask the dean, could he use his office? Because he wanted to continue the conversation constantly with my mother, you know, and tell her these things. But my mother had a relationship that had started with the sons, and it continued. Now, all the family came out in full force to my mother's service that she knew through the years, the older one, because we have that long life gene in us. with Good Lifestyle, and they all showed up. The sister that's alive, we have never heard from her, never heard a word at all, and that's okay. That's her prerogative. It was shocking because before he died, she asked her doctor to give her a cesarean so that he could see his firstborn grandchild. There were actually 8 already here. And I don't know if that's a part of it, if it was just overwhelming. But right now, yes, we can walk up. My sister was at the congressional office a couple weeks ago, seeing one of the other senators, can't think of it, Senator Scott, and they're asking us to participate in something that has to do with literacy. And she decided to drop in Paul's office. And hey, come on in. Now, do we have just an open, just warm, fuzzy relationship? So you keep a secret for over 66 years, of your life. I think it's going to take time, but always cordial, always friendly, always nice, inviting my mother to dinner and what have you. And we're kind of slowly, it's a slow process, what feels comfortable. So if that kind of answers your question. Yes?
I just wanted to know, I know that it took quite some time before it surfaced about your lineage and being the granddaughter of Sean Thurman, but being that you're a part of the revolt, the Black Panther movement, did it ever leak out, or did you ever receive any backlash or criticism from those members of the Black Panther?
I never told. First of all, I think I must have went in my bedroom and cried. And I said, okay, you're never going to tell anybody this. I went right on with my practices after that. However, it did slowly change my heart. And there's certain things I didn't have to say. And like I said, all the rhetoric coming out of the 70s, it was about asserting yourself, empowering yourself. I toned down on that. And it would be years later, and then I found out years after that my father's mother was Cherokee. I had no idea, which I had asked my father about his background. So I kind of got hit with 2 sides, didn't know about the Cherokee side there, and then about the Caucasian side. But yeah, it kind of started to change me, because as you mature and you're reconciling who you are just as an individual in this world and what is your place, what are you going to do here, and your time that you have on this planet, then I began to think about accepting all of me. And so I'm 58 years old, and to stand up here and openly and publicly admit 25 years ago I couldn't have done that. Because it means accepting, and it means change, the revolution within. One of my favorite pieces of music are Looking at the Man in the Mirror. Can you look at yourself for all that you are? And if you come down here, my mother is a story of thousands and thousands of African slaves that were brought here, and even up until modern times. So it's really being able to look at yourself. I just accept me for who I am. I'm not ashamed of who I am. Even though I came through here what people would call illegitimate circumstances, I don't think any kids are illegitimate. They all get here the same way, okay? So that's pretty much, yes. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes. Yeah, let me get a mic to you if you want. Oh, okay.
My question for you is, you said you were just at Clemson, and they just recently had the building Tillman's name change. How would you feel if someone was to propose the idea to change Thurman's building's name?
Okay. I'm ready for that. I think it should be called the Strom Thurmond Essie Mae Washington Williams Institute. That brings balance, because that's what we want to do. We are Americans. We live here in America. We're going to be in each other's way. We need to prepare for the change, because by 2020, the United States will be brown, and we will need to learn other languages. You know, so it's not even going to be African Americans. It's not going to be Caucasians. It's going to be people with Hispanic backgrounds. They're already here. So both sides need to reconcile, have a reckoning with the world and as it's going to be. So going back to judge not the ethnicity, scrutinize the character. I know messed up people from all races, you know. So that goes down all sides. But that's my ideal. I reserve the right now, I repeat, and it's on Twitter already, what I said last night about Tillman. I had never even heard of Tillman until 3 months before I came to do this. And it was interesting because that talk was planned over a year and a half ago. It was for Black History Month. All these things happened in between, so believe me, I had lunch with 6 students, 6 African American students yesterday, and they gave me an earful. And also, reporters kept asking me strange questions like, do you expect this will reconcile some of that? And I said, expect? What do I expect? I'm coming to speak for Black History Month. I have no expectations, but to share some experiences with you. And then it took 2 days before I realized, and I started getting the reports. So I had read up on Tillman just because it was a building, and I started reading about Calhoun because I wanted to know why was John Thurman so interested in this man. And so I began to read up on it, and I can see where he developed a lot of his ideals and thoughts, and from Tillman. So this is what I told them last night. I said, I come in peace first, and I'm not going to come in here and start telling the good people of South Carolina what you need to do. That's what trustees, constituents, community members, students, any stakeholder that has a stake in what's going on. Changing a name is changing a name, but how do you change the minds of people? So I feel that you guys need to make that decision. You need to have conversation after conversation of the possibilities that what could be done where something positive can come out. So maybe you might want to add a name on the Tillman too that reflects the diversity of the campus. Is that helpful? Thank you. Yes. Okay. Yes.
This is not a question, this is just a comment.
Okay.
I just want to say thank you for your presentation. It was very informational and inspirational. And just on behalf of the student body, I'd like to say thank you for challenging us to better ourselves so that we can empower others and empower ourselves.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes. In 2013. Did she sit up in the front?
Yeah.
I know who that. I know who she. Yes, she's a cousin. She's a cousin. Yes.
Yes.
And you go here to Winthrop? Oh, congratulations.
And she just was like, she after she went to the funeral, I read your mother's book, and
Nice.
it was very interesting. And she was telling me about an event that happened when your mother was in Coastville. There was like a lynching.
Okay. Yes.
And after that, it seemed like the family kind of scrutinized your mother a little bit. Like they would come to the house and they would tell the children kind of stay away. It's a little dangerous if you connect yourself with her. I was wondering if maybe your family had ever felt scrutinized due to your mother's lineage or anything like that, in other areas.
No, because my mother denied it. There's an author by the name of Marilyn Thompson who even came out to LA. We had people come and knock on our doors, and that's another reason why my mother said, I need to also tell you when strange people come to the door, and this is what they do, they ask for Miss Essie Mae. That's a clue right there, because in Los Angeles they don't say that, But the other part, I've never heard what you're sharing with me before, because many people in Coastville knew nothing. But the people who were from South Carolina, there was a connection between people going from South Carolina to Coatesville, Pennsylvania because of the steel mills, and they could get good work there. So there were a number of people who came from out of here. But that particular lynching you're talking about, no, because my mother was only about 10 when that occurred, and she was shocked. And I actually had that, and I think as a part of the presentation, where it actually was up there. I didn't talk about it, but her beloved Coatesville, that's when the lynching happened. And he was only accused, and they went to the jail and pulled him out. So it did shock people because they expected something like that to happen in the Deep South, but they did. But Jim Crow was all over. It was just done, even in California. It was just done differently. So, but you'll have to familiarize me with that. I never heard that before. But thank you for letting me recognize you, and if you have something to say to me afterwards, that's fine. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.